And we're going to be looking at one of the shorter books in the Old Testament today, and then not next Sunday, but 2 weeks down the road. It's a very fascinating little book. The whole book is a story. It has a wonderful plot in it. It's got some tension. It's got some conflict. It's even got a little bit of romance sprinkled into the story. Now, just as a bit of background here. In the 1700s, so none of us were around, but just think way back, 1700s, Benjamin Franklin was the United States ambassador to the country of France. And while he was living in France, he tried to connect with French culture in every single way that he could. And he became so popular while he was living in France that everybody wanted to be around Benjamin Franklin. Everybody wanted to be seen with him. And one of the groups that he connected with was a group called the Infidels Club. I don't know where they came up with that name, but they were a group of intellectuals who loved to search for, read, and discuss obscure literary manuscripts. Kind of like a modern-day book club. You know, you read the book, you get together, and you talk about it. Well, that was their book club. But the people in the Infidels Club were largely agnostics and atheists, and they mocked at and made fun of the Bible. At one of their meetings, Benjamin showed up, and he told them that he had just discovered an obscure ancient manuscript, and he asked them if he could read it to them. And when he finished reading the story, his listeners were unanimous with their praise of this wonderful short story that he had read to them. In fact, they said it was one of the most beautiful stories they had ever heard. And they were puzzled because none of them had ever heard of this story before. And they demanded where he had found such a remarkable story. And it was to Benjamin Franklin's delight to tell them that the story he had read to them was from the Bible. And it was the book of Ruth. And it's the book of Ruth that we're going to be looking at today and 2 weeks from today. So I want you to take your Bibles, turn to Ruth chapter 1, and we'll be working through the first 2 chapters of the book this morning. Ruth chapter 1, starting verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judea. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So the first thing we notice as we look at these verses is the timeline. The book of Ruth takes place in the time of Judges. And it was about a year and a half ago, Matt took us through the book of Judges. And you know, the book of Judges was an awful time. It was a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was a time of chaos, a time of moral decay. It was a time without hope. It was an awful time in the nation of Israel. But I want you to realize what's happening here, because in the midst of one of the darkest times in the history of Israel, we have this story. The story of Ruth is kind of like the other side of the coin to the book of Judges. In this story, we're going to meet people who, while living in this incredibly dark time, love and honor God and live lives that honor Him and are pleasing to Him. So even in a dark time like the Judges, good things are happening and God is at work. And you know, when Matt was taking us through Judges a while ago, and as I was looking at it again now, I see the similarities between the time of Judges and present-day Canada. Just look at Canada today. Morality is on the decline. Lawlessness is on the increase. Chaos is all around us. People are living for themselves. They don't live for their neighbors or for others. They live for themselves. And even in leadership In our country, we see lawlessness. We see a lack of morality. We see a total lack of integrity. But one of the things we're going to see as we work our way through the book of Ruth is that even in the midst of the worst times, God is still at work. He was at work in the story of Ruth, and he's at work in Canada today. Just like in Ruth, he's calling a people out to himself. He's guiding his people, and he's honoring those who are honoring him. So back to Ruth. In the famine, Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons leave Bethlehem and move to the country of Moab. And it's likely that they intended this to just be a short stay, but as the famine continued, so did their stay in Moab. And you'll notice that Elimelech is called an Ephrathite. Now, Ephrathites were a distinguished family. They were well known within the community. They were respected. They were landowners. So everybody in the community knew Elimelech and Naomi. They were well known. But then, while living in Moab, disaster strikes. Elimelech died. Naomi is now a widow. She's dependent on her 2 sons to provide for her. And Naomi's 2 boys get married. They both marry Moabite women. And then, after living in Moab for around 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion die. And Naomi is now left without husband and without sons. While living in a foreign land, she has lost all male protection. And folks, in this society, women did not live alone. They were dependent first on father, then on husband, and then on sons for sustenance and for care. And sorry to be a bit blunt here, but if a woman in that society if a widow had no sons, she would often either sell herself into slavery, turn to prostitution, or die. There were really almost no other options for a widow living alone in their culture. And that's where Naomi finds herself. Verse 6, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah." Now, Naomi has one other option available to her. She has heard that the famine is over, and so she is going to go back to Bethlehem with the hope that extended family and friends will look after her and help her. And it's interesting that as she travels back to Bethlehem, both Ruth and Orpah, her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, decide to go with her. Verse 8, "But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.'" Naomi turns to her 2 daughters-in-law and encourages them to go home, to go back to Moab. She blesses them, and she prays that God will deal as kindly with them as they have with her and with her sons. Naomi sees no advantage at all in them going back with her to Bethlehem. They would be outsiders. But again, both Ruth and Orpah say, "We're going with you to Bethlehem." Verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you wait therefore until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.'" Naomi again encourages Ruth and Orpah to go home. And she tells them that if they go with her to Bethlehem, there will be no hope of her giving them a husband. Now, what Naomi is referring here to is an ancient custom called levirate marriage. And let me describe levirate marriage to you. There's a slide that's going to come up just to help us to understand levirate marriage. I think it's coming up. There we go. So let's look at an imaginary scenario here. And I just picked names out of the blue. But let's say Jack marries Jill. Now, Jack dies, and neither he and Jill do not have a son. So in levirate marriage, what happens is it is Jack's brother's responsibility to marry Jill so that Jill can have a son. So Jill is going to marry her brother-in-law so that she can have a son. And when Jill and Joe, the brother-in-law, have a son, and we'll call him James, then James becomes the heir not of Joe, his birth father, but of Jack, his mom's deceased husband. I know it's a little confusing, but the point here is then the deceased husband, Jack, has an heir. Even though he died without a son, he has an heir. And there were 3 benefits for this within their society. The first one was then Jill would have a son to look after her in her old age. She would not be a widow alone. And the second benefit was that Jack's land would be passed on to this son who was not his birth son, but his heir. So the land stayed in the family. Very important. But the third thing was that Jack's heritage continued. His name carried on through this son who was not his birth son, but who was his kind of adopted son. And what Naomi is saying is this: I'm in my 40s. Chances are I will never get married again. And even if I do get married and have sons, are you going to wait for 20 years until those sons are old enough to marry you? And so Naomi is saying, don't wait, just go back home. She sees that her future is uncertain and hopeless, and there's no point in Orpah and Ruth going with her on the chance that she get married, and then they could marry her sons 20 years later. And then Naomi expresses her heart, and she says that all of this has happened to her because the hand of the Lord is against her. She feels like God has deserted her. But the thing that's interesting here is even though she feels like God has turned his back on her, I think she's expressing 2 things in what she's saying. First of all, she's expressing that God is sovereign. What happened to me is not by chance. It was the hand of the Lord. And the second thing that she's saying is the Lord is still my God. I will not turn my back on him and reject him. She is acknowledging that God is in her story. And you know, it's a good example for all of us to follow, isn't it? Hard times will come. Trials will come. We'll all go through things that are tough in life, whatever they are. And when things fall apart, we remember these 2 things. God is in control, and God is still my God, no matter what is happening. Verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Again, both Orpah and Ruth respond. Orpah kisses Naomi farewell and goes back to Moab. She wanted to be a wife. She wanted to be a mother, and she didn't want to wait 20 years, and you can't blame her. So she goes home to be a wife and a mother. But Ruth responds with loyalty to Naomi. Verse 15. And she, Naomi, said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said to her, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything departs you, if anything but death parts you from me. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Orpah goes back home, back to her family, back to the gods of Moab, and she is now no longer a part of the story. She turns her back on her newfound faith in the God of Israel, in the God called Yahweh, and goes home. And Naomi uses Orpah's decision to try and encourage Ruth to do the same. But then in these 2 verses here, verses 16 and 17, I think we have what is one of the most beautiful statements of commitment in the whole Bible. Ruth commits to leaving everything that she has known. She is leaving behind her family, the religion in which she grew up. She's leaving behind everything that is comfortable. And she's fully committing herself to Naomi, to Naomi's land, to Naomi's people, and to Naomi's God, Yahweh. And she's moving into the unknown. She's forsaking everything she has known all her life for Naomi and for Yahweh. Have you ever been in a position where you need to make a hard decision like that? Do I go back to what's comfortable? Or do I go ahead to what God is calling me to do, even though it may be very hard and very difficult? Ruth isn't thinking short term. This is a lifelong commitment that she is about to make. She knows that her chances of having husband and family, if she goes to Judah as a widow and as a Moabite, is very slim. But her love for Naomi and for Yahweh outweigh even her desire to have a family. And then you notice the words, Ruth says, "There will I be buried." In this culture, it was essential to be buried with family in the family plot. And by saying this, Ruth is simply declaring, no turning back, no turning back. A number of years ago, I taught a baptismal class. And at the end of the class, I asked everyone involved, in your own words, what does baptism mean to you? And one person said, it's like walking through a door. And when I asked her to explain, here's how she explained it. She said, when I get baptized, I'm going to be walking through a door. On one side of that door is my old life in the world. On the other side is my new life in Jesus. And when I walk through that door, I slam it shut on that old life, never to go back. And I walk into my new life with Jesus, never to leave. The old is gone. The new has come. And in essence, that's what Ruth is doing here. She's slamming the door shut on everything that had to do with her old life in Moab. And she's opening that door to move into a new life in Judah with Naomi and serving Yahweh. Does she know what's ahead? No. Can she expect that everything that is ahead for her will be great, that it will work out the way she wants it to? No. This is an act of faith. She is placing her faith in Yahweh as she goes with Naomi to the land of Judah. And she even calls down divine judgment on herself if she violates this commitment. Ruth is changing her citizenship. She's going from Moab to Judah, and she's going from Chemosh, the god of Moab, to Yahweh. Sound familiar? When we became a follower of Jesus, we changed our citizenship. We now see this earth as a temporary dwelling place, and we can say with Paul that our citizenship is in heaven. And when Naomi saw Ruth's determination and commitment, she was silent. Verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. When Naomi and Ruth arrived back in Bethlehem, you can just imagine the buzz that they caused. Just think, returning after 10 years. Naomi, very well known in the community, had left 10 years earlier with a husband and 2 sons. Now she's back with only a daughter-in-law, and a Moabite daughter-in-law at that. You know, like when you go to a 10-year or a 20-year reunion, and there's some people there that haven't changed one bit. They look exactly the same as they did 10 and 20 years ago. And there's other people there that until you hear their name, you have no idea who they are. Remember times like that? Well, that's what it's like here with Naomi. The women were both excited and distressed. "Is that really you, Naomi?" And Naomi's response, she changes her name from Naomi, which means pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter. She acknowledges that God has made her life bitter, that God has brought calamity into her life. Remember what Job's wife said to him when God allowed calamity to come into his life? She said, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job's response, "You speak like a fool. Shall we receive good from God and not evil?" And I think we see the same here in Naomi. While she's hurting and very disappointed, we don't see her cursing God or turning her back on God. Rather, she accepts what has come to her as from the hand of the Lord. And again, I ask the question, can we be like Naomi? Even though we're hurting and distressed at the hardness of life, at the trials that come, we don't turn our back on God. Rather, we accept both good and hardship as from a sovereign God. And rather than blaming God, we accept it as coming from him. Verse 22 tells us two interesting things. Naomi had just declared that she came back empty, but the author corrects her. She came back with Ruth. She wasn't empty. And secondly, they came back to Bethlehem at just the right time of the year, at the beginning of the barley harvest. And again, we see that God's hand is all over this story, because this was just the right time for them to come back to Bethlehem. Chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now we meet Boaz, a wealthy, influential man, lives in Bethlehem, and interestingly, he's related to Elimelech. So by marriage, he's related to Naomi and to Ruth. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, Ruth is here speaking of something called gleaning. In the Old Testament law, Moses wrote a couple of things about harvesting in the fields. And one of the things he wrote was that the harvesters shouldn't harvest right along the edge of the field. They would leave that. And the second thing he wrote was that anytime a harvester accidentally dropped something, whatever the produce was, they were just to leave it on the ground. And this was God's way of looking after the poor, one of the ways, because then the poor could come after the harvesters were finished, and they could harvest along the edge, and they could pick up everything that was dropped. And that was called gleaning, one of God's ways of providing for the poor. And Ruth is aware of this custom, and so she's going to go and look for a landowner who will allow her, a widow, a Moabite, to glean in his field. Ruth is willing to work hard to put food on the table. Her and Naomi have nothing. Ruth isn't lazy. She's not expecting handouts. She knows that she needs to work to put food on the table. And so she goes out. And in whose field did she just happen to glean? In the field of Boaz, her relative. She didn't know the people. She didn't know the landowners. She'd only been in Bethlehem a few days. And yet again, we see God at work. In God's world, things don't happen by chance. This was not a chance encounter. This was God at work. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but God is sovereign. He is in control. Verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to his reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they responded, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short break." Who would show up at exactly the same day that Ruth came to the field to do the gleaning? It wasn't customary for landowners to come to the fields. They didn't do that. And yet here, by chance, comes Boaz. The author is continuing to emphasize in a subtle way that in God's world, things do not happen by chance, that he is active in our world. Again, we're seeing God's timing. And when Boaz notices this stranger, a young woman, he asks his foreman about her. And a foreman tells him that this is Ruth, who came with Naomi from the land of Moab and is living with and looking after Naomi. She's asked for permission to glean, and she's working hard in the field. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And then Ruth said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Boaz actually goes over and talks to Ruth. Again, something that was not normally done. Ruth has no idea that this man is a relative. All that she knows is he's the owner of the field, and she's hoping that he will allow her to stay in the field. But you see what Boaz does? Not only does he give her permission to stay in the field, he encourages her to glean only in his field right until the end of the harvest. And he also gives her permission to glean among the harvesters. Normally, you weren't allowed to glean in a field until the harvesters were finished that section and had moved on. But Boaz says, no, you go and glean right among those who are harvesting. Why is Boaz being so kind to Ruth? Because he's heard about what Ruth has done for Naomi. He's heard that Ruth left everything behind to come to Bethlehem to live with, to support, and to care for Naomi. And he's also heard that Ruth has put her trust in Yahweh, placing herself under his protection, just like a chick finds protection under the wings of the mother hen. Now, just think about this. Ruth has only been in Bethlehem for a few days, and yet everyone in town is talking about her. She's a foreigner. She's a widow. She's very poor, and yet people are speaking well of her. Why? Because they see her character. They see who she truly is. They're not looking at the outside. They're looking at her character, and they're impressed. So take a minute and look at yourself. What are the people around you saying about you? The people with whom you work, your neighbors, your friends, your family, the people in your class. What are they saying about you? Do they talk about you like the people of Bethlehem were talking about Ruth? Do they speak of you as a person with upstanding character? Do they speak of you as one who puts the needs of others before your own needs? Do they speak of you as one who has placed your trust in God and who's living a life that is pleasing to him? Personal story. I was in the library, the Gibson's library, just a week or two ago, and I was there to sign out a movie that I had put on hold. But, long story, but because of extenuating circumstances, I wasn't able to sign the movie out. And one of the fellows who worked at the library, he came over and he went, just go ahead and take it. Return it when you're done. And then he said this. He said, I know you're an honest person. I trust you. I don't know who this guy is. I've never talked to him other than in the library. And yet I have done something, I don't even know what, to give him the impression, I'm glad I did, that I'm an honest and a trustworthy person. Remember what Jesus said? Others will know you by your fruit. What fruit is showing up in your life? By what kind of fruit do people know you? Ruth was known by her fruit. She had done things that had impressed the people of Bethlehem, enough so that they spoke highly of her. What kind of fruit are people seeing when they're looking at you. Ruth expresses her gratitude to Boaz for all that he is doing for her. Verse 14, and at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and Boaz passed to her the roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So when it comes time for the afternoon meal, Boaz does something that a landowner never does. Teeny bit of romance beginning to sneak in here, I think. Boaz invites Ruth to join him and his workers for dinner. Now remember, Boaz has paid for this food. His own staff have prepared it for his harvesters. This was his meal for his workers. And yet he invites Ruth to come and join them. And not only does he invite her to join them, he shares with her the best part of the meal, the roasted grain. And he gave her more than she could eat. And then Boaz goes and tells his workers, when you're harvesting, just accidentally drop a little bit every now and then so Ruth can pick it up, so she can glean it. Verse 17, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it came to about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And Naomi said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." In some versions there use the phrase kinsman redeemer. And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close to my young men until they have finished the harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." This still is the time of the judges. Ruth had a great first day of gleaning. She came home with around 30 pounds of barley, enough to feed her and Naomi for over a week. She takes the barley and the roasted grain, which was her leftover dinner, to Naomi, who's astonished at the amount of barley that Ruth picked up that one day. And when she learns that Ruth is gleaning in the field of Boaz, she blesses him for the kindness that he has shown to them as widows. And she then tells Ruth that Boaz is one of our kinsman redeemers, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. And Naomi agrees with Boaz that Ruth continue to glean in his field until the end of the harvest. Verse 23, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. From the beginning of the barley harvest to the end of the wheat harvest is around 10 or 11 weeks. And that whole time, Ruth worked hard, long days, 6 days a week, gleaning in the fields. And if each day was as profitable as her first day, she picked up enough grain to feed her and Naomi for over a year. And through it all, she continued to live with and to support her mother-in-law. Okay. As I look at these chapters, there's 3 things that I want to point out, because there's 3 things that really stand out to me. And the first one is this: our choices matter. Every one of us need to make choices every day. Some of those choices will be easy. Some of those choices will be very difficult. But choices are important, because the choices we make impact not only us, they also impact the people around us. Ruth had to make some very difficult choices. She made the choice to leave behind everything that was familiar to her. She made the choice to move into an uncertain future. She made the choice to forsake the religion of Moab and to become a follower of Yahweh. She made the choice to care for Naomi, and the whole thing of caring for family. That could be another whole talk sometime, couldn't it? Ruth made the choice to find a field in which she could glean. And she made the choice to work hard to provide, both for Naomi and for her. Difficult choices. And it kind of seems, as you read through those two chapters, that Ruth thought things through as she made the choices that she did. And when you have choices to make choices that both honor God and that respect those who are around you as you make those choices. And the second thing that stands out to me is this: our fruit is evident to others. What we do is seen by others. How we act is observed by others. The words that we speak are heard by others. People are watching us. People were watching Ruth, and what they saw impressed them. What do people see when they're watching you? What do people hear when they're listening to you? Does what you do point others to Jesus? Does what you say point others to Jesus? Or do your actions and words push people away from Jesus? What we do and what we say matters. Because, as Jesus said, people will know us by our fruit. And then the third thing that stands out to me is this: God is in your story. Look at your life right now. Look at your story. Do you see God at work leading and guiding and directing? Do you see God working in your life? To be honest, sometimes we don't. Ruth didn't always see God at work in her life. She just did what needed to be done. She made the choices that she needed to make, and she carried on with life. She didn't stop. She didn't give up. She didn't get discouraged. She just did what she needed to do, and God worked. You know, often God is working in our lives behind the scenes. We can't always see what he's doing in the moment. We can't always feel that God is working in the moment. But God was doing that in Ruth's life, and he's doing that in our lives. And because we know that God is working, we don't give up. We don't take it easy. We don't just relax and do nothing. It means that we carry on with life, that we trust God to do his work in our life, no matter what comes, that we live the life that he has handed to us. Ruth's life wasn't easy. It was hard. And life is often hard. We live in a fallen world. Things aren't easy. But we must never forget that God is at work in our lives. Just as he was in the life of Ruth, he's at work in our lives. And like I said, we may not see it now. We may not even see it next week or next month. But I think the day will come when we can look back and we can say, yeah, that was God. He did that. He did that. He did that. He was at work in my life. God is in our story. And I really think that these three things are very important to us as we live our Christian lives. That we make wise, God-honoring decisions. That we honor Jesus in what we do and in what we say, so that we have a positive impact on those around us. So that we attract them to Jesus by the way we live. And also the third thing, God is in control. He is at work in our lives, no matter what we see, no matter what is going on. God is at work. He is working in our lives even today. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this amazing story, this story of Ruth, this woman who left everything and gave her life to you. Thank you that you are our God. Thank you that you love us and that you care for us. Thank you that you are a part of our lives and that no matter what comes our way, we can know that you are in control, that you are leading and that you are guiding. Father, thank you that you are our God. We bless you. In Jesus' name, amen.